Hello and a very warm welcome to the show, everyone. Great to see everyone. And I'm really excited to welcome Sara Bagheri to the show. Hello, Sara. How are you today?
Hi, Victoria. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Well, when we met and I learned more about your area, and I was really interested in this whole, I suppose, coming together of communication with neurodiversity and neuroinclusion. And I felt this was a really important topic for us to talk about on the podcast, something we've not talked about before. And certainly for people who are maybe managers of people who are experiencing or having neurodiverse needs, but even for people who are experiencing that themselves. But first of all, let's start with perhaps just some understanding. There are lots of different words to do with this topic. And could you just help us understand them in a bit better detail, please?
Yes, absolutely. And I think just to point out, actually, that we are hearing a lot more language in our culture around neuroinclusion, which is a really positive thing for me because it shows that we're starting to have a culture shift in understanding and the awareness around neuroinclusion. So I just wanted to point that out. And I think the fact, as you say, that we're having podcasts around neuroinclusion, there's lots of magazines and articles and LinkedIn posts. So I think any lens that highlights this area of communication, the intersection of communication and neuroinclusion, is really, really positive. So let's start with some concepts and vocabulary definitions. So I'm going to start with the term neurodiversity. And what we mean by the term neurodiversity is referring to all of the brains. So that's your brain, my brain, whether you're neurodivergent or not. So it refers to the whole human experience of the brain. And the brain regulates, it processes information, it processes behaviors, it's responsible for a whole huge range of function. When we break that neurodiversity term down, we then have neurotypical and we have neurodivergent. So neurotypical would refer to the majority of the population whose brains are wired in a particular way that conform to social norms and social expectations. I would add that there's a lot of research at the moment which are kind of contesting this idea of kind of typical brain. But for now, that's kind of where we are with the neurotypical definition. And then we have neurodivergent brains. And this is the kind of the population or the client group that we're going to be thinking about today. And this is kind of thinking that those particular brains are wired in a different way. So it's a neurological difference that we're seeing. It's not a kind of personality or a flaw or kind of related to intellectual capability. It's just that the brain processes information in a very different way. And then even when we look at neurodivergent kind of clients, neurodivergence is actually a very, very big umbrella term. So within that, we have various conditions like autism, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And I think actually I know we only have limited time today, and I'd be doing a complete disservice to talking about all of the conditions in this time that we have. So I think it would be helpful to focus on ADHD for today, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. And that was just really helpful sort of starting point for us, because I think words matter. And so it really is important to understand how we talk about this. So let's get into talking about ADHD. I'm really curious, bring this to the workplace and thinking about people who are listening to this who may either be diagnosed ADHD or maybe even not have a diagnosis but suspect they might be, or even managers of people who think they may be working with team members who have it. How might that look or show up, particularly through communication and behaviors?
Yeah. And I think just the fact that we're asking the questions, or managers and organizations are asking the questions around how can I support my talent or my employees who may, or as you rightly pointed out, may or may not have a diagnosis, or may not have disclosed. We know that disclosure rates are really quite low within the workplace. So actually, there's a lot of onus on organizations to try and be almost to be at the forefront, not waiting for employees to kind of share information, but to be really curious as to how they can help their employees if they think they're struggling. So the type of things that you might see, if we look at it from a kind of from a very communication and interaction lens, is organization. And when I talk about organization, we can be thinking about our organization of our thoughts and our language. So it may be in meetings that you may have an employee who can go off on tangents when they're talking. They might lose the thread of what they're saying. So it might be quite what we call quite long narratives that kind of start at one place. They might be answering the question or responding to the kind of the problem or the particular task that they're on, but they might end up in quite a different place. And there are advantages to that, which I will come on to. We might also see some impulsivity when they're talking or communicating. So it could be that they interrupt others, or there might be a sense of urgency when they're talking. So they might speak over others, or perhaps blurt things out at the wrong time when it might seem like the wrong time. The other things that we might notice are things like the honesty and directness of communication. So that can be misinterpreted sometimes, that it can be very direct or quite blunt. So there's lots of communication features that may show up when, particularly in those kind of group scenarios that we see.
I find that really interesting because, as you know, my world, part of my world is the intersection between communication and cultural intelligence. And the things that you've described there very much align with three of behavioral preferences that I sometimes see across national cultures as well. How direct somebody is, whether they are high context and need to give lots of detail, or whether they prefer to go straight to the point, and how expressive they are. So I'm finding this very interesting, reflecting on this right now. So that's how it might show up. And I suppose, when we see that, people can misinterpret it, right? There
Mm-hmm.
can be. So can you tell us more about, how does that, how can we manage that? If this is a, say, manager of somebody who they think might have ADHD, or perhaps they have already disclosed that to them, and they're seeing some of these patterns, these behaviors, and maybe it's causing friction within the team. That's quite tricky. So I'm really curious about, like, what are ways that we can get into practical, I suppose, approaches and strategies that might help in these situations.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right to kind of point out that overlap with cultural intelligence. And I think one of the first kind of questions that I will often say to managers is this idea of assumptions, and what assumptions are you making? And can we think about the communication style that your employee is showing to you in a different way? So that's the first thing. I think that curiosity aspect and thinking about things differently. The second thing I would think about are those practical strategies. So there's lots of practical strategies that we can talk to managers about to make the employee feel really safe. And also the other aspect is about the employee being productive in that environment. So they can be at their best, they can be valued, and they can succeed in that work environment. So a few of the things that tend to come up, and each organization is quite different depending on the industry that they're in, the number of employees, the type of task demands that they have as part of the role. But some of the key things which seem to come up are team meetings. And I would say one of the most effective things that we can do is to prepare. And by that, I mean sending out agendas beforehand so that there's a really clear structure as to what is going to be discussed, what the expectations are of people within that meeting. So, because we know that not everybody is, that kind of participation style of a meeting where it's very conversational, it's very immediate with your responses, it's on the spot that you're having to give your answers or contributions to. That doesn't tend to suit everybody, and particularly neurodivergent clients. So giving them the opportunity to know what's going to be discussed in team meetings before, so that they can perhaps make notes, bullet points, and share those within the meetings. Because I think you're much more likely to get more and rich ideas from your team if you offer a wide range of participation styles. The second thing I would think about is the idea of your own communication style. So we know processing of language can be very challenging, particularly if your manager or your supervisor has a communication style where they use very long instructions. They can be quite verbose. It can be quite ambiguous what they're asking you. So reflect on your own communication style. So what is it that you are trying to ask your team? Be really specific about the outcomes and the task objectives. And that doesn't just benefit the person who may be neurodivergent, it will benefit everybody. So think about your own communication style. The third thing I would think about is don't just rely on verbal means to communicate. Can you support what you do with visuals? So slides, decks, anything that really supports that verbal and cognitive load. And again, that is something that benefits everybody.
I'm just going to jump in there because I find this really fascinating because there is something in this where you kind of go, well, this is actually meeting best practice. This is actually what we should all be doing, right? But I also know the reality of the clients I support and work with, the organizations I work in, the people that I hear from, which is the pace often doesn't allow for that level of preparation and forethought before the meeting actually happens. So what I'm hearing is actually if we put those structures back in place, it can not only benefit people who are neurodiverse, but also can benefit everybody. Is that how I understand it?
Yes, absolutely. And, if you think about, I'm just thinking about school settings and education settings, actually, by giving kind of visual structures to all of the children or young people in the classroom, they're all going to benefit. And it's the same in the workplace. Anything that supports language and communication, anything visually that supports giving structures, really clear kind of templates. And I do appreciate that preparation can't always happen, and I do understand that, and I think that can sometimes be a point of friction or some pushback when you work with organizations as to I can't always do that. So it is about thinking, well, what else could I do? So if you're not able to do that, how about asking for feedback or input from team members in a different format after the meeting? So can they email ideas? Can they write down their thoughts and then share them in a different space, voice note them? I think we're getting really creative as to how we can use technology to support the neurodivergent population.
And I also really reflecting on everything you're just saying there is also true for when we're working in very diverse multicultural teams where people are, speaking not their first language, perhaps as English as their first language. Actually, this helps as well with clarity. So I love that. Sara, I'm really curious though, is there a difference when it comes to thinking about neuroinclusion for virtual meetings compared to in-person meetings? Is there anything specific that needs to be taken into account?
Yes, there is actually, because I think one of the kind of things that many of my clients do struggle with is the kind of the sensory aspect.
Mm.
And what we mean by that is they often need more sensory input. So that can mean taking a break from the workspace that they're in, maybe having, we call them kind of fidget tools. So that can be something quite small and discreet that you can just use just to regulate yourself. So I often find when clients are on virtual meetings, especially if they have to have their camera on, they can't take that kind of break or maybe that movement in the chair that they might be able to have in a physical meeting. So actually that's where sensory kind of toys are quite helpful, if you like. So they can fidget with those very discreetly. I know that some organizations, depending on what you're covering in virtual meetings, if it's training, you can have the option to have your camera on or off. You can participate in the chat rather than participating verbally. So there's lots of little things that you can think about to make things more inclusive.
So that's really planning for the virtual space.
Yes.
And then in person, what else would change?
Yeah, so in person, again, it's very unique to the individual, and it will depend on if it's a one-to-one meeting, for example, like a performance review. Again, I think it's about the manager thinking about what can we do differently so that we're not giving the client special treatment. We're just removing some of the barriers that make it really difficult for that employee to access what we're asking them to do. So, for example, if we think about performance reviews, so do they know the structures and the templates that are going to be worked through? Have they been told exactly how long the performance review might take? The type of participation that will be involved? And is there a conversation, of kind of a short conversation that could happen before that performance review where you can find out what will help that person? Do they need more processing time? Do they need to have the questions or the template printed so that they can refer to them? Do they need a notebook to write bullet points? So I think it's about that communication with the individual as well, because as you say, there are kind of some strategies that do benefit everybody, but it is also about having that individual conversation to find out what works for them.
I love that. And I think, that also includes elements such as empathy, of course, but also curiosity, asking questions. And coming back to your point about assumptions, not assuming that everybody's experience is the same, that there might be very specific needs that they have that can help.
Yeah.
That's really, I really appreciate those very practical ideas, strategies here. And, I want to roll back to something you said right towards the beginning, which was about also the role of the manager is to help that person feel safe. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are around how to do that. How directly should a manager be having conversations with somebody? How much should they be also talking to the team about this? I'm really curious about any kind of guidelines on this.
Yes. And psychological safety is really key in the workplace. And I think I mentioned that disclosure rates are really, really very low. I think there's a number of reasons why people don't want to disclose. Often there's a fear around judgment. They might worry about their career progression. They might be worried about being seen as difficult. So I would say the idea of safety needs to come from a culture within the organization. So how have you, not if we kind of almost put neurodivergent employees to one side, but think about how have you managed other kind of changes within the workplace? So thinking about maternity, how has that been managed? Or other mental health support within the team? Because that all sends a message that we're a team, we're an organization that looks after our employees. So I think that will also set a precedent for how comfortable people will feel. The other things is about modeling. I think being really making it very natural within meetings about asking the questions. Okay, who prefer, does anybody want me to do printouts? Does anybody want to get the agenda notes beforehand? Shall we use AI to record the notes? So almost normalizing how all these different range of communication and participation styles, and checking ourselves. So are we sometimes consciously or unconsciously showing preference to particular communication styles? Usually that extrovert style where we can give feedback or make comments on the spot, or we might have a particular kind of organizational style which is very, very calm, very linear, very organized, and the manager may praise that or show preferential kind of comments or treatment to a particular employee that shows that style, when actually we should be kind of saying creative thinking, amazing. We love that kind of that very kind of high energy, enthusiastic problem solving approach. Let's bring more of that. So I think it's a modeling as well of how that manager communicates with their team and welcoming all those participation styles.
I really like that. And I sort of, what I'm hearing from you is almost that sense of this isn't just about inclusion for one specific person or one specific needs. It's recognizing and knowing yourself, knowing your own predominant communication style, how you show up, how you interact, and also recognizing that it's really important. And I say in my own work, to hear all the voices. That are you just hearing from one or two people all the time, or are you really making the effort and commitment to hear from everybody in the room? So I really appreciate that, Sara.
And I think you're right. Actually, there can be, particularly in the kind of the professional or the corporate world, there can be a leaning on a particular kind of style, if you like, and contribution. But I think if we can think about the strengths that a lot of, again, just thinking about ADHD specifically, the strengths that can bring, we kind of touched on the ideas of that that kind of particular energetic communication style, that enthusiasm. And often I notice with clients, they're able to move very much from, okay, this is the problem and this is the action. Whereas some colleagues can be stuck in, they can really take their time, they can perhaps overthink. So actually, if you have a team member who is very action focused and who can move into that space quite quickly because of that energetic style, it's a very positive energy to have, and you can cut through some of that paralysis that you might have with decision making. And the same with things like, we know that people with ADHD can have hyperfocus. So they can have a lot of high passion and be very kind of that deep focus, if you like, on a particular project. And that is a real asset to have, that to have that level of commitment and passion and a new way of thinking about something is that can only be a positive within your team. So I think focusing on those strengths, sometimes we can think a lot about the challenges and the modifications, but actually flipping it and thinking, what can we bring? What does that talent bring to our team?
Thank you so much for pointing that out. And I think that's a really important point, because we might see this as a really challenging situation context. How do we make this work? But actually, if we kind of really align as well, the working style, the communication style, the strengths that brings, it can bring, I can imagine, a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, a lot of different perspective. So actually, that's really important to remember.
Yes.
And likewise, I'm really curious. I mean, do you see that this is something that is both men and women and people of all genders particularly have, or is it something which is more one gender or the other?
Yeah, I think historically we often thought about neurodivergent clients. So I'm also including kind of autism within that definition, and ADHD as boys and men. And the reason for that is we had a very narrow diagnostic criteria. So for ADHD, for example, the criteria and the way we would think about how it would present would be this kind of hyperactivity. And actually, what we know is that girls and women present very, very differently. So there tends to be more of an internal restlessness rather than that external restlessness and impulsivity that we might see. We also see a lot of masking with women, particularly what we mean by masking is strategies and attempts to fit in with the social norms and expectations a lot more than men and boys do. So they would try and copy their peers socially in conversations. And that leads to a lot of burnout, because if you're in a work environment, you're trying to fit in socially with all of your peers, it's exhausting. And I think alongside that, there's also the emotional and mental load that a lot of particularly mothers will hold as well. So the presentation is quite different with women with ADHD. The other thing that we see is diagnosis tends to be a lot later. So typically women and girls are diagnosed 5 years later. And if they're not diagnosed in childhood, they don't tend to be diagnosed until their 30s and 40s, which, if you think that's a huge kind of chunk of your lifetime of navigating some of these symptoms and not necessarily having an understanding of why you might be experiencing some of these challenges. And also not recognizing some of those strengths that you have, not playing into those. So I think that later diagnosis, often around perimenopause and menopause, women tend to have a lot of questions around, because there's that reflection time in that period in your life. And I think a lot of women then do question, is there something else going on here for me? So there's lots of, I think, we need to think about women and girls' presentation differently as well. And that also reflects in the type of strategies and support tools that we would put in place.
I understand. And it feels like there is a lot there. And it's interesting that you mentioned about women particularly being diagnosed later in life. Interestingly, I've noticed a number of people in my own kind of context in my own life who've suddenly discovered this as well for themselves. And as you say, that's quite tough going if you've been coping for all those years in your career and costing you quite a lot of energy to do that.
Yeah.
I think the one thing we haven't particularly talked about here today yet, though, is what if somebody is listening and they are the person who is has ADHD or is neurodiverse. We've talked a lot about how managers can approach this, but what about if you are the person yourself who is either diagnosed or perhaps you suspect, that person suspects that they may have that. What are ways to engage in the workplace around this conversation, particularly if this is something new and hasn't really been raised previously?
Yes, yeah. And I think you're right. We know that waiting lists for diagnoses are particularly long. On the NHS, we've got waiting lists up to kind of 2 years, and a private assessment is often not an option for lots of people as well. So I would say that actually the first thing I'd say, you don't need to have a formal diagnosis to have a conversation with somebody within your workspace. The second thing which I would suggest is having an awareness of your own strengths and challenges. Because if you're communicating and advocating that, you need to have a sense of, these are the things that I am brilliant at. And I'm going to start with the strengths. These are the things that are my superpowers within the workplace that I can really add value to. And that could be some of the things we spoke about, like that energetic communication style, that creativity, that problem solving. So get really specific about the things that you're really good at, the good stuff that you're bringing and the value that you're adding. And then thinking about the challenges that you have within the workplace. Again, be really specific. I find it really difficult if we're in an open plan office and it's quite noisy. And then what you need, what are the options, having a range of options, because as you say, I always think it's good to have almost like a menu of things, because it may be that your first option isn't viable or isn't workable in that particular workplace. So If noise, for example, and sensory input is quite challenging for you, then thinking about particular positions within the workspace, a particular desk arrangement, noise cancelling headphones, taking your breaks or lunch times at particular times. And in order to get to that space, if you like, of knowing what you need, there does have to be some discovery. And the best way, something I do with clients, is we do an assessment where I look at the client's kind of profile of communication interaction. So we really, really dig deep to find out, what is it about processing questions and instructions that you find challenging? Is it an area that you find challenging? What is it about organizing your thoughts and ideas? You know, are you somebody that you just blurt out, or you just go off on tangents, or you give very long explanations? What helps you? And it's not about, and this kind of goes back to the medical model that we used to have a very long time ago, which was about fixing the individual, curing them, treating them. And the neurodiversity movement has really come a long way in terms of saying, yes, the client does have challenges, but actually we need to change the workplace as well. We have to adapt the workplace so that we can support that client, that employee. So for me, it's a little bit of both. It's about the client knowing what they need and having that assessment to kind of really unpick what's going on for them. A piece of work around how to advocate for themselves, how to express themselves really clearly and explain, this is what I find hard and this is what I need. This would help me. Sometimes that phrasing is really, really powerful. Having scripts that you rehearse, or even writing down. I think that idea of preparation to keep you on track, to keep you focused, is really helpful. And within the and then going and choosing your moment to have that conversation. And I think timing, as you say, timing is always quite key about when you have these conversations. You don't necessarily have to go into, again, this will be different depending on how comfortable you feel. You don't necessarily have to give a whole history of your ADHD diagnoses or not, but be specific about how it affects you in the workplace, because I think having tangible, concrete things is really helpful for managers to action things.
That's fantastic, Sara. And thank you for being very specific and really giving some great ideas. And hopefully, people listening, if they are looking to have those conversations with their line manager, with their teams, with the organization, that would be really helpful for them to start and engage with these conversations. Sara, this has been a really fascinating conversation to me. I think this is a really important part of cultural intelligence, of ensuring people feel included, feel like they belong. And it's a topic that I think is increasingly becoming important in the workplace. So thank you so much for bringing the richness of your insights, both for line managers and people managing people who are neurodiverse and have ADHD, but also for those who are experiencing that as well for themselves. So I really appreciate that. Where can people, learn more about you and also what's coming up for you next?
Yes, so I have a website, Fluence Comms. So there's lots of information there, particularly around the assessment that I carry out with clients, so that you can really explore your communication, interaction, strengths and needs. So that's a great place to start. LinkedIn is my kind of main way of communicating. So do check out my LinkedIn. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts and ideas and what resonated with you. And I think the more kind of lived experience that we hear about, and sometimes it's the experiences within the workplace that haven't been as positive, which are the fuel for making change. So I would, if you do have experiences, I'd love to hear from you. And I think having the conversation as well, I'm definitely noticing a shift in this idea of awareness of neuroinclusion and how to support neurodivergent employees into action. And I think I'd encourage organizations, because they will all have different resources as well. Even if it's just a lunch and learn training session, that's a great start point. And it's about building on that, because we'll all be in different spaces as to where we are with that neuroinclusion journey. But I think it's important that we start somewhere. So I'm very much about crediting, applauding any organization that is even thinking about it or reaching out to find out about how to support neurodivergent employees.
Fantastic. Well, I love that sort of last thought, which is about starting, make a start, take a step forward. And of course, we'll put all your links in the show notes. Sara, thank you so much for joining me here today. Sara Bagheri, really appreciate it. Really great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Victoria.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing everyone next time on the show.